Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. We are back for season 36. And if, as ever, you'd like to become a patron of the podcast and haven't done so yet, you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. We would love you to become a patron, even if for a tiny amount. And thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 36, episode 1, the Italo-Turkish War. This podcast is written by Nicholas Mora, who is from Canada but now lives in Boston, Massachusetts, and studied history in college. Today he largely focuses his reading on early 20th century military history. At the turn of the 19th century, Italy, a newly unified upstart great power, was looking to expand its political and economic influence into neighbouring North Africa. Just a few years earlier, France had taken effective control of the North African coast from Tunisia to Morocco, while Egypt was a British protectorate. Just two areas of North Africa were unoccupied by Western European powers, Morocco and Ottoman Libya. By 1910, Italian nationalists and war hawks increasingly demanded some kind of Italian political action to occupy Libya, but Governor Giovanni Giolitti remained stalwart against war. That is, until the balance of power in North Africa once again shifted. In July of 1911, the Agadir crisis, or the Second Moroccan Crisis, began, culminating in the joint annexation of Morocco by French and Spanish colonial authorities. This put Libya in the unique and uncomfortable position as the last bastion against Western colonialism in North Africa. Italian nationalists, this time with the support of most political leadership in the country, demanded war. The Italians were fearful that France or the United Kingdom would manufacture an excuse to swiftly occupy Libya, blocking Italian colonial expansion. Italian political leadership hoped that, like other European colonial wars, their expedition to Libya would be quick, low intensity, and end after the occupation of a few major ports along the Libyan coast. Unfortunately for Italy, the war would last significantly longer and come with a huge loss of money and human life. On September 28, 1911, the Italians sent an ultimatum to the Ottoman government demanding the surrender of Libya. The Ottoman government promptly refused the Italian ultimatum. A state of war now existed between the newest and oldest European great powers. At the start of the conflict, the Ottoman military was stretched thin. The Ottoman army was dealing with a significant revolt in Yemen and Albania, as well as unrest across much of the empire. These events led to a drawing down of the Ottoman garrison in Libya by over 80%, from 16,000 to less than 3,500 regular troops. The Ottoman navy lacked any experience, funding, and modern doctrine. The Ottomans had only two semi-modern ex-German Brandenburg-class ships purchased in the late 1890s, two protected cruisers, and 8 modern destroyers. In contrast, the Italian navy had access to 10 cruisers and 9 battleships. This naval disparity, along with the geographical position of Libya, French colonies in the west, nominally British colonies in the east, and a much stronger Italian navy patrolling the coast, meant the Ottomans would be unable to resupply their Libyan troops in any meaningful way. As such, prior to the war, the Ottoman military had decided they would abandon population centres and withdraw into the deserts and oases that dotted the region and work alongside the Arab tribes that populated Libya, fighting guerrilla conflict. The first shots of the war rang out on the 29th of September 1911. 5 Italian destroyers engaged 2 Ottoman torpedo boats along the Greek coast, then sailed into the port of Nicopolis on the morning of the 30th, sinking 2 more Ottoman ships. Italian naval action continued into early October, while the Italian army mobilized their reserves and prepared their invasion force. Italian ships based in Eritrea bombed a number of ports in Yemen, sinking over 7 ships and capturing a significant amount of arms and equipment. On October 2nd, the Italian landing force arrived off the coast of Libya outside the city of Tripoli with 34,000 men, 1,100 wagons, 72 guns, and several battleships to provide close naval support. In contrast, the Ottomans had roughly 5,000 regulars stationed across Libya. After refusing Italian demands to surrender, Tripoli was shelled, and on the 4th of October, roughly 2,000 Italian troops landed and captured the city with no resistance. The Ottomans had withdrawn with as much equipment, camels, and willing men as they could muster. At the same time, Italian troops were capturing Tripoli. Another force of 500 Marines landed and accepted the surrender of the city of Tobruk with its meagre 70-man garrison. Just over 2 weeks later, the Italians encountered their first serious engagement while landing around 500 Marines at the town of Benghazi. Several thousand regular and irregular Ottoman troops were stationed in the city and fiercely defended it. After a day of fighting, the Italians captured the town thanks to the support from heavy naval gunfire. The Italians suffered 36 dead and 88 wounded, capturing the town. By the end of October, the Italian Expeditionary Corps under Lieutenant General Carlo Caneva and the 44,000 men under his command had occupied Tobruk, Tripoli, Homs, Derna, and Benghazi, almost all the major population centres on the Libyan coast. The problem the Italians faced was that Ottoman forces had withdrawn, and the Italians had been unable to engage in meaningful combat to defeat Ottomans. But Ottoman troops stayed close enough to Italian coastal footholds to maintain pressure, but far enough to avoid an unsatisfactory engagement. Outside of the populated coast, the Libyan countryside was harsh, with little to no water or road infrastructure. The Italians were fearful of marching beyond their lines and risking a massacre similar to what occurred in Adwa, where the Ethiopians defeated the Italian army. Toward the end of October 1911, Italian fears of a massacre almost came true. Neset Bey, commander of Ottoman troops outside Tripoli, massed his 4,000 regular and thousands of irregular troops for a push between a gap in Italian trench lines, ringing the city. After a short bombardment, Ottoman troops rushed the trench line and were able to flank nearby Italian positions. General Caneva had to rush thousands of Italian troops to close the gap, and after 2 days of fierce fighting, the Italians had recaptured their positions. Over 500 Italian troops had been killed at the end of the fighting. Italian leadership was shocked. Caneva immediately demanded more troops from Italy, while sailors and artillerymen were brought in to reinforce the front lines. 3 days later, another determined Ottoman attack again broke Italian lines. After several more days of fighting, the Italians again managed to push the Ottomans out. This second attack had a devastating psychological impact on Italian military leaders in Libya. The Italian line was shortened dramatically, creating a tight ring of fortifications around the small city of Tripoli. The concentration of Italian troops would result in a cholera outbreak which would run rampant for the next 6 months. By the end of November, 2 months after the start of the war, Over 90,000 Italian troops were stationed in Libya, and the Italians had been unable or unwilling to move beyond their small coastal positions captured in the opening days of the conflict. The determined defence by Ottoman troops stationed in Libya inspired hundreds of enterprising young Ottoman officers to smuggle themselves across Egypt and Tunisia to join the Ottoman army in Libya. Both Mustafa Kemal, founder of the modern-day Turkey, and Enver Pasha, the future military leader of the Ottoman Empire, crossed Africa to assist in the fight against the Italians outside the city of Derna. These officers would dramatically impact the fighting ability of Ottoman troops. During this period of deadlock, planes were used for the first time to bomb the enemy. In November, after locating the position of Ottoman artillery, an Italian flew over Ain Zara and dropped 2 bombs into the encampment, marking the Italo-Turkish War as the first conflict fought in land, sea, and air. The campaign would remain deadlocked for the remainder of 1911, with the Italians unable to leave the coast and the Ottomans unable to break Italian positions. Untrained for and ill-equipped to wage desert warfare, the Italians were unable to make any further substantial advances for the duration of the conflict. Their enemy, consisting largely of irregulars unable to wage conventional warfare, could not eject them from their entrenched positions. The result was deadlock. For months the Ottoman headquarters in the Tripoli region was located just 7 kilometers south of Tripoli at the Ain Zara oasis. There, Nezet Bey had about 2,000 regular and irregular troops, but the Italians were unwilling to leave the security of their trench lines to attack this position. When the Italians finally ventured out at the end of December, they did so with overwhelming force, and 18,000 troops were sent from Tripoli to strike at the oasis alongside heavy 152mm and 203mm guns. The land just outside the city was harsh and difficult for the Italian troops. Its shifting sand dunes proved difficult to march through, and so the army was forced to stick to the narrow, winding trails between sand mounds. After 4 hours' march, the Italian columns engaged the outnumbered Ottomans. After several hours of fighting, they had captured Ain Zara, but the Ottomans under Nezet Bey were able to withdraw in good order to another oasis some 20 kilometers to the south. The Battle of Ain Zara cost the Italians 17 dead and 94 wounded, while the Ottomans suffered at least several hundred dead and wounded. Again, the Italians failed to deal a death blow to Ottoman troops. The Italians now stationed several thousand soldiers at Ain Zara and built a railroad from the oasis to Tripoli city. Throughout the rest of 1911, the Italian forces would continue to land and capture the few remaining fishing and coastal villages across much of the Libyan coast, which they had not yet occupied, often suffering few casualties as Ottoman troops simply withdrew out of range of Italian naval artillery. In the eastern theatre at Derna, Benghazi, and Tobruk, there had been little combat outside of the initial landings. Italian troop numbers had ballooned to 20,000 in Benghazi, 15,000 at Derna, and 5,000 at Tobruk. However, this relative peace on the Eastern Front would change in late December. After months of training, Enver Pasha's force stationed 15 kilometers outside of Derna was ready to go on the offensive. On the 27th of December, Ottoman troops destroyed a portion of the aqueduct which supplied water to the city of Derna. In response, the Italians dispatched 3 columns to repair the damage. While on the march, Enver's troops pounced on the Italians, and after heavy fighting, the Italians were forced to withdraw, with 1 column almost being destroyed by charging Ottoman troops. In response to this attack, 3 days later, the Italian command dispatched a large force to repair the aqueduct and defeat any Ottomans in the area. This raiding strategy would become a typical image of the conflict. The Italians would mass a huge force and sally out from their coastal defences, attacking Ottoman positions and then withdrawing back to their coastal garrison after a day or two. This stalemate forced the Italians to come up with innovative ways to strike further from their positions. To ease logistical needs, 300 motor vehicles were imported from Italy alongside 2,000 camels. Some of these vehicles were modified to carry armour, swivelling turrets and Maxim machine guns. The Italians also made use of 3 airships. These were used for bombing and aerial reconnaissance. One interesting moment of innovation came when Guglielmo Marconi, famous at the time as a radio innovator, visited Tripoli to assist in wireless communication development for Italian troops, eventually settling on a radio which could be mounted to a mule for forward observation for land and sea artillery. After months of deadlock in Libya, the Italians expanded the conflict to draw the Ottomans to the negotiating table. In January and February of 1912, Italian ships struck Ottoman ports across the Red Sea, sinking several vessels and destroying port facilities. At the end of February 1912, 2 Italian cruisers sailed to Beirut, sinking 2 ships and killing over 100 Ottoman troops. In late April, an Italian naval squadron departed Taranto in southern Italy for Rhodes with 3,000 men, 350 pack animals and supplies for 4 weeks. On the 1st of May, Italian ships cut communication cables and began landing troops on the east of the island. By the night of the 2nd of May, Italian troops were only 2 kilometres from Rhodes city and had only engaged in light skirmishing. By the end of May, the Italians had occupied the entirety of Rhodes and 8 additional islands across the Dodecanese, capturing roughly 2,000 Ottoman troops. The majority of the Greek population of these islands greeted Italian troops as liberators from the Ottoman Empire. The war was now entering its 10th month. The Italians had expanded the war to the Red Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, and Dodecanese islands, but the Ottomans were uninterested in accepting the Italian demands for peace. For the summer of 1912 through to the autumn, Italian strategy persisted, raiding Ottoman positions and defending their positions from Ottoman raids. In September of 1912, a year after the war had begun, peace still proved to be elusive for the Italian government, with over 100,000 troops overseas and 46.9% of the national budget being spent on military spending. The Italians needed to change the strategy. Thus, the Italian military would break out of their coastal footholds and expand their control in Libya. For reference, at this point, the Derna foothold was only 6.5 kilometers long and 5 kilometers deep, but had 20,000 Italian troops. The new Italian policy of forward movement was displayed at Zanzur, just a few kilometers away from Tripoli. 12,000 Italian troops, supported by cavalry and artillery, advanced in several long columns and engaged an Ottoman force of roughly 7,000 regular and irregular troops. The Italian advancing forces suffered 500 casualties, but were able to inflict over 2,000 on the Ottomans. The Italians had managed to capture the battlefield swiftly. Ironically, it would not be the newfound confidence and aggression of Italian military action in Libya that would eventually force the Ottomans to the negotiating table, but instead a series of events in the Balkans. By September 12th, over a year since the war had begun, Ottoman and Italian negotiators had been meeting in Switzerland to discuss peace, to little effect. However, the relations between the Balkan states and the Ottomans had deteriorated, and war looked likely. The Italians now saw an opportunity and sent an ultimatum on October the 2nd: accept their terms or they would withdraw from the negotiations and widen the war to new theatres. Less than a week later, the opening shots of the First Balkan War were fired, and by the 14th of October, with a more pressing conflict closer to home, the Ottomans accepted the Italian treaty over a year after it had begun, the Italo-Turkish War was over. By the war's end, hundreds of thousands of Italian troops had been sent overseas. The quick Italian colonial expedition had turned into a stalemate and cost almost 50% of the state budget. The Ottoman Empire surrendered Libya to Italian control, and both states agreed on an eventual Italian withdrawal from the Dodecanese Islands. Thousands of Italians and tens of thousands of Turkish and Arab troops had been killed or wounded, and irregular warfare would continue in Libya for years to come. Italy would remain in control of Libya for 3 more decades, until the Second World War. Well, thank you, Nicholas, for writing that script for us. It was a pleasure to read, and I hope it was a pleasure for all of you to listen to. If you would like to write a script for us, just like Nicholas has, then drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org. We are always pleased to hear from you, whether it's for an idea for a script or an idea for a podcast subject. Please do get in touch. And again, please do become a patron of the podcast by going to patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Nicholas Morra, read by Nick Barker.